today's lesson, I'm going to go in a little bit different order than normal. I'm going to start on page 27 and kind of bounce around this lesson a little bit because I think some of the stuff makes a little bit more sense if you see it first. So as an understanding of evolution increased over time, the scientists sort of changed how they classified the different species of organisms. And they began to classify them based on the different common ancestors that they may have shared and their evolutionary history. So not just about their characteristics, but they looked back at their evolutionary history to see how similar groups might have been. And then the more recent the common ancestor is, the more closely related they were to be to that. So species, and this is our key sentence, so species with similar evolutionary histories are classified more closely together. Now, when we talk about this evolutionary history, what scientists use is what's called a branching tree diagram to look at those evolutionary histories. And that is basically just showing the probable evolutionary relationship among organisms, as well as the order in which those characteristics may have evolved. So if you look at this branching tree diagram that is shown to you down here, this is showing us a possible order in which some characteristics may have evolved over time. This is just one branch of this. There would be many branches coming off of this and going in different directions, but it's basically just saying that, if there was a common ancestor that had 4 limbs, at some point, some of those organisms might have developed an amniotic egg over time. And then some of those might have branched off to a group that had fur. Some of those then may have branched off into a group that had specialized teeth for shearing or tearing apart foods. And then some of those may have branched off into a group that had retractable claws. So over time, organisms developed these characteristics. They passed those characteristics on to their offspring, and then the organisms themselves sort of evolved over time. So what we call a shared derived characteristic is a trait, kind of like fur, that common ancestors of a group had and then passed on to its descendants. And we'll talk a little bit later when we talk about Charles Darwin and natural selection that oftentimes these traits will happen as a mutation. So there's a species of organism that's there's a mutation that causes a different characteristic, but that characteristic is helpful to it. So it survives and it passes that trait on to its offspring, and over time it just becomes a common characteristic in that particular organism. So a branching tree diagram is just a way to look at the evolutionary history of an organism and kind of look at the order in which some of those characteristics may have evolved over time. Sometimes organisms may evolve or have similar characteristics, but it's not because they are necessarily related evolutionarily, but it's because they evolved in a similar environment. So sometimes unrelated organisms evolve similar characteristics, but it's because they evolved in similar environments, for example, moving through water or flying in the air, or because they eat similar foods, but not because they were necessarily related. And the process by which unrelated organisms evolve characteristics that are similar is called convergent evolution. So in that branching tree diagram that we looked at, those were related organisms that evolved over time. In convergent evolution, we're basically just saying that yes, they have similar characteristics. They're not necessarily related. They just evolved in a similar environment. Kind of like whales and fish. They're not super closely related evolutionarily, but since they evolved in water and in similar environments, they show similar characteristics. Now I'm going to bounce back to the first page in this lesson and talk about Charles Darwin. He first published an explanation for how species could change over time back in like 1859. If you remember, and you've probably heard this before, the process of change over time is called evolution. So in just very general terms, it just, the process of change. So organisms show some changes over time, and we're going to look at a really good example of this in just a second. And he thought that this change happened based on natural selection, which is, and let's kind of highlight this. So natural selection is the process by which individuals that are better adapted to their environment are more likely to survive and reproduce than other members of the same species. So let's say that there's an organism of a species that maybe through some sort of mutation has a characteristic change that none of the others have. If that characteristic helps it survive, then it will live and have offspring, and it will pass that trait to its offspring. They in turn survive, pass the trait. So after repeated generations, that characteristic or that trait becomes the dominant trait in the species, while the other one sort of dies off, if you will, and is no longer there. One of the best examples of this is the peppered moth. I'm going to hop over to this webpage. I'm going to give you this link somewhere in the assignment to have you kind of go over here and look. But what happened was when you get to this link, I would like you to go up to this section here that's called Natural Selection, and you can read about the peppered moth. What happened was this was in England, and there was a species of moth that was very light in color, and it blended in, it camouflaged perfectly with the trees in the area. But then the Industrial Revolution happened. And during the Industrial Revolution, a lot of soot and smoke was put into the air in England, and a lot of that began to build up on the trees and the sides of buildings, and it kind of turned black and sooty. So what would happen was these light colored moths all of a sudden, instead of blending in and being camouflaged, would stand out against the darker background, and birds could easily see them and eat them. Because of mutations, there were a few dark colored moths that now blended into the sooty environment where they would have stood out before. Those were the moths that then lived and passed the characteristic for the darker color onto their offspring. So over time, more and more of the light moths were getting eaten, not surviving long enough to have offspring. The darker colored moths were the ones that were surviving and passing that trait on to their offspring. So over time, the larger population of moths was then the darker colored moth. Well, after a while, and they began to clean up the area and started, environmental protection and that type of stuff, and things got cleaned up and the soot kind of went away. Well, then the dark moths were the ones that were standing out against the lighter backgrounds. And then the species of moth shifted back to being lighter in color again. So that's just one example how we have seen natural selection in action over a relatively short period of time. And when you go to this website, you will see it says play the game over here. And if you click on that, you can choose whether you want the light forest or the dark forest, and you can play the game. So basically what you do, if we click on the light forest, you're going to have a bird that you can move around, and you can eat the moths. So when you see a moth, you can tap on it. You should be able to just tap right on your screen with your finger, I believe, on your Chromebook. It's a little hard to do with the touchpad. But you can just go through and eat some moths, and it will give you a timer up here, and it will tell you how many moths you have eaten. And then when you're done, it will give you some information. So back to the lesson. Again, that was Charles Darwin. His theory of evolution, or theory of natural selection, talking about how those species that are better suited for the environment will be the species that will live and pass on its characteristics to its offspring. All right, so go to the link to that webpage in the assignment and practice eating moths with your bird. And thanks for listening. I'll see you later.